If you've been enjoying listening to Consider Before Consuming, consider signing up to give $1 a month to support our efforts. Your contribution, whatever the amount, can make a significant difference in our efforts to educate individuals on the impacts of pornography. Sign up to give just $1 every month at ftnd.org/give1. That's ftnd.org/GIVE and the number 1.
My name is Garrett Jonsson, and you're listening to Consider Before Consuming, a podcast by Fight the New Drug. And in case you're new here, Fight the New Drug is a non-religious and non-legislative organization that exists to provide individuals the opportunity to make an informed decision regarding pornography by raising awareness on its harmful effects using only science, facts, and personal accounts. We want these conversations to be educational, uplifting, and hopeful. As we sit down with experts, influencers, activists, and people with personal accounts, we cover a wide variety of topics that may be triggering to some. You can refer to the episode notes for a specific trigger warning. Listener discretion is advised. Today's episode is with Cassidy Brown. She's a student, an influencer, and a creator. She uses her platform to share her story. Part of her experience is that she was first introduced to pornography at the age of 9 and developed a dependency to porn for more than a decade while no one knew. During this conversation, we talk about how her porn consumption negatively impacted her, how she's addressed it, and what she's up to today. With that being said, let's jump into the conversation. We hope you enjoy this episode of Consider Before Consuming. We appreciate you joining us on the podcast. It's a big deal. And again, we will say this probably a million times. Thank you. The first thing that I think people should know is kind of who you are and what you do.
Yeah, for sure. That's definitely a loaded question. Starting from the beginning, I was born and raised in Jacksonville, Florida, and I lived the majority of my life up until I was around 12 there. And from there, that's a very short summary, but in there, that's where my porn addiction kind of started from, is within those younger years. And I graduated. I want to say here in Florida, it's a little different. Like the education systems are a little bit different, but graduated from what was middle school at the time and then went on to junior high and started that in Texas and went all the way up until senior year, graduated, did some community college, dropped out because, why not? And took 2 years for a gap year. And I just started my freshman year at SCU Jacksonville, which is our extension site here in Jax. And I have loved every minute of my gap years, but I decided, it's time to get back into school and, get off of social media as much and do something with my life. So that's where I'm at right now.
That's cool. Transitioning from a gap year can be challenging, to get back into it. Mm-hmm. Has that been tough for you?
It definitely has. There's a lot of self-discipline that I had to teach myself. Obviously, over the 2 years of me being a gap year person, I had to watch my friends, thrive in college environments, do sororities, fraternities, and all that stuff, and seem like they were having, the best time of their lives while I was at home.
Yeah.
And while I was at home, I was being, creative on social media, and that was definitely hard for some of my friends to understand, and I lost quite a bit of friendships throughout those 2 years because they were like, why am I off studying my butt off to get an education and you're sitting at home on social media? And in my defense, it worked out.
Yeah, I was gonna say, do you think that was out a little bit of bitterness?
Yeah, definitely does.
Yeah. So speaking of which, you're a creative, and I'm curious which outlet you enjoy most out of all of the things you do.
Oh, they all have their perks. I'd probably say TikTok for the most, because I feel like I can be the most creative on there just because of the trends that are always changing and stuff. When it comes to TikTok, you're always going to have your positives and your negatives out of really any social media. But primarily from TikTok, some of the positives that I've seen is I can share my story and create awareness more quickly than I can on Instagram, a bigger platform. And some of the negatives are, you have the potential to, from what I've seen, is I'll post about pornography, awareness of trafficking, whatever it might be on my TikTok channel. And in the comment section, it's horrid. Like, it's disgusting. There are people commenting crazy things, hateful things, disgusting things. And for me, I have to go through daily and delete those comments. And so it takes a long time to go through and delete over all of those hate comments and nasty comments, because I would never want my social media channel or page to be somewhere where somebody's coming to get educated or to get, freedom from, whatever they're struggling with, and they see a comment, it makes them fall. Makes them, go back into that,
Right.
go back and watch. I would never want to be that avenue for them on accident without even knowing it.
Wow.
So that's one of the negative things. And obviously you're faced with hate. You have people that are not only attacking, your opinion about pornography or whatever, but then they start attacking you.
Yeah.
And that's when it starts getting hurtful. You're like, okay, not only are you
That's
attacking
real
my
tough.
opinion, but now you're attacking me as a person and my looks and, my beliefs or whatever. And so it's definitely challenging, but
Yeah. I was going to ask you if you read the comments, because, a lot of people put a boundary to not read the comments because of that reason, because they can be so negative. But I kind of admire the fact that you're so responsible and considerate, that you're actually taking the time to delete the ones that are inappropriate. That takes a lot.
it does. And it's definitely draining, because I do have friends in the social media world that, they'll get their comments. They get probably over 200, 300 a day, and they don't look at them. They don't read them.
Yeah.
And they always ask me, doesn't that cause anxiety for you reading yours? And honestly, it more so puts a passion in me to okay, well, since you're obviously not getting it, I guess I need to explain it more because you're not picking up what I'm laying down.
Yeah.
And so there's definitely, there's days where I go through probably at least 50 to 80 comments where it's all negative, or I've had people in my DMs on Instagram, especially. Instagram is the one where it's it definitely gets, when you got a bad one on Instagram, you really got a bad one. And there was a DM from a guy who had watched my TikToks and screenshotted many of them and said, this is false news. You're not getting this from science. You're getting this from opinions. This is just, what you believe. And also, by the way, you're ugly. You don't fit in. You don't have any friends. This is why you sucked in high school. And I'm like, did you see me in high school? Did we know each other in high school? And so there's definitely you have to be confident in who you are before you go on social media, because if you're not, it can so easily tear you down.
Oh, wow. Yeah, you're right.
Yeah.
Yeah, as I prepared for the conversation, I was looking over your TikTok, and I saw on your TikTok recently, one of your videos had over 200,000 views and had 400 comments. Mm-hmm. So if a video remains and has 400 comments, how many comments did you delete? I'm just kind of curious.
Goodness. Probably over 100. I go through every morning. I'll wake up and I'll go, which isn't probably the best mental thing for me at the moment for my mental health, but I'll go on social media and I'll scroll through the comments, and if I see one I don't like, it's almost refreshing to not go back and have to get fired up and respond, but it's so just it's therapeutic to just delete and keep on moving, because they thought they did something, but they really didn't do anything. They got deleted. So
Yeah, that's cool.
yeah.
Well, it seems like you're really responsible and considerate, and I really admire that. And I've heard you refer to yourself as an advocate for the voiceless. And as we begin the conversation, I think it'd be cool to get your perspective on why you think it's important to be an advocate for the voiceless.
Yeah, so my definition of voiceless is basically the younger generation. And obviously people have different takes on what voiceless, means to them. But for me, whenever I said I wanted to be an advocate for the voiceless, I want to be somebody that I needed when I was younger. And obviously, as, in the younger generations, you look up to people much more often than you do when you're older. And so you're trying to find that one person to latch on to. Mine was always Selena Gomez, Hannah Montana, The Huge from Disney Channel. But
sure.
As I got older, I realized that I didn't need to be looking to, people on TV, but I really needed somebody that was either my age or older that could say, hey, I'm a woman struggling in pornography, and this is how you get out, or this is how you find freedom, or this is how, or, even going from the stance of this is why it's bad. Honestly, if somebody would have done that when I was 10, 11, 12, even into my older years, if somebody would have said this is why it's bad, I probably would have stopped sooner. But I just never heard why it was bad. All I knew is that, men do it, it's not good for you and whatever. Those are very blanketed statements. I didn't hear, you never heard a woman talk about pornography when I was growing up. And if you did, it was taboo. They were joking about it, or, it was a lie or false or whatever, And so I definitely, for my younger self, I needed somebody that was older than me, that was a woman, that was a girl, and that could have poured into me at the time and be like, you're not alone. Years of, time that I spent in my room just like either crying or feeling so depressed or whatever it was, going through anxiety because I thought that I was the only one that was watching these things and, reading these things and looking at these things online and thinking that I was doing it all by myself in secret and nobody knew about it. When in reality, like, other people did know, and other people were actually going through it, and I just never realized. And so I just have a big heart for the younger generation of knowing, like, when they're growing up, it's not all a secret. It does harm you. It is, very harmful to your mental health and for people around you and involved in it, trafficking and stuff. So
yeah, that's real cool. You're forming a little community, and there's power in that community to have other people to relate to. It's a very cathartic experience, so that makes sense. I like that.
Yeah.
To give a little bit more context as to your personal account, can you go way back to your first time exposure to pornography and talk to that and how that was for you?
For sure. So going all the way back, I was in, it's in the 4th grade. Now it's about 9 years old. I think that pans out to the right age.
I have a kid that age, and so, yeah, that does pan out. And it's interesting because he's just so young.
It is extremely young, and, talking about it with my parents now, or at least my mom, she was like, I think you were older than that. And I was like, absolutely not. Like, I can remember, the recess area where I was outside, and I was 9, and I've always been a very curious kid. And also I had a very strict home life. And so my mom and dad were very strict on me, and they wouldn't let me have social media. They wouldn't let me have phones. They wouldn't let me literally anything. I didn't gain any of that until I got into high school. Like, really not, being dramatic here. And so when somebody else had that, I was all over it. I was like, oh my gosh, like, let me see it. Show me how to do it. Like, what do you do on your phone, and everything. And one of the girls that I went to school with, she had walked up to me at recess, and she was like, my brother showed me this morning, and I want to show you, like, it's so cool. And I was expecting Webkins, I was expecting Pop Tropica, whatever was, happening whenever I was younger, Mario Kart, whatever, that's what I was expecting. And she shows me a porn video, and I was like, that's weird. That's not what I expected you to show me. And so my curious mind was like, I want to learn more. Like, I want to watch more. I want to know, what's the site and everything. And so a few weeks went on by, and she brought her phone back to me, her mom's phone back to me, and she was like, I actually just learned that you can look it up anywhere and delete search history. And I was like, whoa, what? Like, what is search history? And so then I started, like, all my gears started turning, and obviously being in a strict household, like, I wanted to rebel. So anything that I could do to rebel, to learn more about this stuff, and, like, rub it behind my parents' face, backs and their faces that they didn't know what was going on. I thought I was really, giving it to them, but in reality, I was just, hurting myself. And so from there, from the age of 9 up until 18, so 18 and 19 actually. So it was, a good 10 years, almost a decade of me watching pornography in my room by myself, and getting into reading it, getting any way that I could access it. I found a way to access it. And honestly, I think during those years, nobody taught me that it was bad. Nobody said anything about it. And so I was like, okay, it's fine. Like, I don't need to get help. I don't need to tell anybody. I really don't need to tell anybody, because it made me feel so good, and I liked watching it and everything. And as I got into the older years, I was like, oh, I watch it. It's like, so I'm educating myself. And so, like, I'm doing it so that, like, one day I'll know what to do in a marriage, or I'm watching it so, like, I'll be educated. So if somebody makes a joke, I'll know what they're talking about. But in, like, reality, like, I couldn't not watch it without, like, feeling that feeling that I got from watching it. And I think we'll talk about this later, but I started, like, developing these deep intimacy and commitment issues to where, like, if I thought that I could get satisfied online, I didn't need anybody else to satisfy me. Or if I thought that, like, me and this person online, like, I would, go through and watch these videos, and every time that I was bored, I thought, like, me and that person were like, oh, yep, we're done. Okay, next video. And so I started doing that in the relationships, and it became this long, like, series of broken hearts and cheating and all this stuff, because I just never found commitment. I never had that modeled in my life. And so that's the long story, long version of it. But
well, thanks for sharing that. And again, it's awesome that you're willing to talk about these things, because that's part of it. Is when we talk about changing the conversation and having healthy conversations about this, there has to be a conversation. And so we appreciate you talking to all of these things. There was a lot, like your personal account is very fascinating to me. As you were speaking, you talked about the rigidity of your, like the home life that you experienced as a kid. Mm-hmm. And it's such a tough thing because as a parent myself, I have empathy for both sides, for the kid and for the caregiver, because we want the best for our kids. And sometimes I think parents turn to rigidity as like the solution.
Yeah.
Do you have any thoughts on how caregivers can better approach it? Because you did experience some of the negative side effects of the rigidity, can you talk to maybe what you would have preferred rather than that?
Definitely. I think now looking back, and also just putting this out there, I don't blame, my parents, or I don't think that they were the reason that I, got into watching it or whatever, but I definitely believe that since they were so strict, I wanted to rebel. And without that line of communication, talking to some of my friends now, they're like, oh, my parents have always been open. We've always talked about things, any questions that I had about life, about guys, about relationships, they would always, super open. And that was never really the case for me and my family. And so I think that, it wasn't modeled in my life very well. And I think that if it's modeled in the appropriate way, in the respectful way, as a family should model it, I think that's like, oh, well, that model doesn't, represent and coincide with the ones that I'm watching online. So that should be a red flag. Mm-hmm. And I think just the open line of communication is so vital because, honestly, if I would have had that, you don't have to sit down and go through every single detail of what pornography is and be like, this is the genre, everything like that. But sitting down and being like, this is a real thing. We're not going to guard you from this. Because when you guard, your child, and what I've experienced is when you guard them for so long and then throw them into the real world, you're like, holy crap, what? Like, all this stuff exists? Like, I didn't know any of that. And so you start experimenting with it because you weren't, it wasn't talked about enough at home. And so I really think that the open line of communication, if somebody would have sat me down and been like, okay, pornography is a real thing. We don't want you to start watching it because this and this and this, and this is what it does. It fuels the human trafficking industry, all these things. Like, you're going to be hurting other people while you're also hurting yourself. And so we want you to be educated on this, and everything. I think if somebody would have sat down and laid out all those facts instead of keeping it so taboo and letting me experiment with it on my own, I think that would have helped me so much.
I think that's why again, our mission statement to fight the new drug, it aligns with kind of what you're saying, because our goal is to educate mm-hmm. on the harmful effects of pornography so people can make an educated decision. And filtration can be good. Filtration can be good, especially for very young kids. Mm-hmm. But the conversation are almost more important, kind of like what you're saying.
Yeah, and, that conversation is going to be awkward, it's going to be weird, but at the end of the day, like, there are so many, I can't even begin to explain how many ways that social media, the internet, and the commercials that they're putting out these days, ads on social media, like, all of them are pushing an agenda, and it's low-key normalizing pornography and naked people and all these things that get your mind, running and racing and all these things. And so the conversation might be awkward, but it's going to be so helpful, because if you don't have that conversation, they're going to think they're different. They're going to think that something's wrong with them. They're going to think like they need to keep this to themselves. Which, if that, line of communication would have been opened, I feel like I would have gotten it off my chest sooner,
Yeah.
Making sure that they understand, like, I'm not being judged, I'm not being shamed, I'm not being guilted or anything like that, but I need to be educated on what that was,
Yeah. I'm going to include in the episode notes a link to some research, because there was some recent surveys done, and I think if I'm remembering this research correctly, there was a group of like 11 to 13-year-olds, and over 50% of them reported they had seen pornography at some point. And then of that 50%, over 60% of them saw it accidentally. So I think the reason why I wanted to highlight that research is because in your case, you also stumbled upon it mm-hmm. through your friend at recess.
Yeah.
And I think that that's important for caregivers to understand, that because sometimes caregivers will say, not my kid. My kid is not going to mm-hmm. actively seek out pornography. Mm-hmm. And the truth is, you never really know, because we're all unique individuals with, freedom of choice. But even if your kid doesn't seek it out, there could be a situation like yours.
Yeah, I think that's so important. I remember my mom saying that right around the time that I started going to therapy and seeking help, for what I was going through. And she was like, well, did you just type it in online? Like, how did you even get to this point? Because I was at the time, I had been through, 10 years of watching it almost weekly. She was like, how did you even get to this point? And I was like, you won't believe this, but, the girl that you really love me being friends with, she was the one who introduced me. And she was like, no, not at all. Not possible. And I was like, it really was. And so that opened a whole other conversation. I mean, like a whole deeper conversation of, her feeling like it was her fault for not checking in on me and everything. And it wasn't at all her fault. It wasn't really anybody's fault. Like, I do believe that it would have been shown to me one way or another.
Yeah.
And, it's what we do with it that matters. And as a young kid, nobody talked to me about that. If they would have had an intervention at school talking about it, then I would have been like, holy crap, this is what I'm doing at home. Nobody knows what I'm doing at home. But, like, these facts are really interesting. And I might have would have stopped sooner,
Yeah, totally. Yeah. We do live presentations, and oftentimes they're to like junior highs and high schools. And I recently presented to a junior high, and there was 2 assemblies of about 400 to 600 kids per assembly. And after the presentation, there's always kids that come up, and I make sure that there's an admin sitting next to me at the end, because there's always kids that come up and they want to talk, and what do they usually want to talk about is they want to express some sort of gratitude for speaking to them about this, being a counter voice for them, because it's cathartic for them. And the most recent one that I'm thinking about, there was a girl who was crying, like pretty intense crying, and man, my heart just felt for her because it seemed like, I don't know her situation completely, but it seemed like she didn't have anyone to talk to, and it was like the first time she had a counter voice that was a healthy conversation around it.
That's awesome. And that also breaks my heart, because I was that girl who I was afraid that if I told anybody, I was going to be looked at as gross. And growing up, whenever I heard the word pornography, widely spread, it was a guy's problem. And it wasn't even necessarily a problem that they defined it as. It was like, oh yeah, guys have hormones, like, we're just gonna put that over in there. They go through a period of watching it, it's just a normal thing.
Yeah.
And they somewhat normalized it just for men, just for guys. And so I got to the point where I was like, I'm worthless. Like, I'm disgusting. Like, I watch the stuff that guys watch. Like, and no women stood up for anybody else and talked about women, And even today, in places that I visit and, places that I go and I listen to people talk about, and there's, obviously many organizations, and there's actually one a gala that I went to a few weeks ago, and it's called Hadassah's Hope. And it's where people go into strip clubs and they, talk to these women about, how to get out of the system, how to get out of the industry. And just hearing all the stories about how, the industry is impacted by pornography, and all of the, like the backstory of industries is, they use those women to film these videos, and the demand of these women increases when more people watch pornography.
Yeah.
And that saddens me so much, because people that are consuming pornography aren't told of that. It's not in fine print underneath the video saying you fueled the human trafficking industry, or you are fueling, women being abused in videos. Like, this is your contribution,
Yeah.
Like, you aren't being told that. And so that just saddens my heart, because there's sometimes where I think, like, how much did I contribute to somebody getting abused, hurt, sold, whatever it is. And I just think Fight the New Drug has done such an awesome job of making that. I didn't know that it was being fueled by that until I started following you guys and reading the articles and stuff that you put out. And I just think that's awesome.
It's a tough thing to realize, and that's part of making an educated decision, is coming to those like realizations, like, whoa, I am fueling this in a roundabout way, or in some ways in a direct way. I wanted to go back to the comment you made that your mom said, how did you get to this point? Because we know that porn can be an escalating behavior, and there's research to show that, empirical research to show that it can be an escalating behavior. But I want to get some anecdotal evidence from you, like from your personal account, in regards to how your porn consumption escalated. And like how soon did you realize that escalation?
I definitely saw an escalation from when I was younger into my older years entering into relationships. So obviously, whenever I was younger, I got introduced, like I said, around, in the grade of 4, around the age of 9. And so going from that age of not dating anybody, not being in any, obviously serious relationships, I was like using it for curiosity purposes, and it made me feel a certain way. And now looking back, I was recently diagnosed with OCD, and it was misdiagnosed as anxiety for a very long time. And so I figured out that all of those years when I would get stressed, when I would get afraid, when I would get freaked out, whatever it was, I would turn to pornography as a I forget the word, but as a release or
some type of like escapism or coping mechanism.
Yes, coping mechanism. I would go to that and be like, okay, this makes me feel a certain way. I'm going to forget about everything else going on in my life and focus on this.
Yeah.
And so that was one thing that I was like, okay, well, now looking back, I can see how that escalated, because as I got older, I realized I had a lot more stress going on in my life. And as I entered in these relationships starting around sophomore year of high school, I would incorporate, somehow pornography would get incorporated into these relationships. And so whenever I get into them, it would kind of die off, and I'd be, consumed by the person in the relationship. I'd be busy by that. And then there would come a time where I would get bored, and I get really bored in that relationship, and I turn right back around to pornography, and I break up with the person right after, and I just go right into a deep, because I would just feel so disconnected with who I was. And so I turned to that because I thought that would make me feel better, and I thought that I would gain knowledge of who I was or something from that, and I thought that was true love, and I thought I could be satisfied by that, and it just left me empty every single time I watched it. And now looking back, I can see that, but at the time I was like, why do I want this more and more and more? It's because it's leaving me more empty and more empty,
Yeah.
And that just went with me in every relationship. And so if I wasn't the one watching it in the relationship, I was dating a guy that would watch it, instead of me. And then there was one super toxic relationship I was in where we were both watching it, and I was like, I don't think, this really deeply did not feel right. The fact that we're both watching it, if I watch it, it's fine. If just you watch it, that's okay. But if we're both watching it, it was very, I felt very pressured to live up to expectations that were, unrealistic. And so I would also, as somebody who was in these relationships, I would project, such unrealistic expectations on these guys. And, poor guys, I feel really bad for them. So sorry. But I would expect them to satisfy me in ways that I was, looking online to this fake love, oh my gosh, I feel so content from these people that are actors online.
Right.
And I would, expect them to make me feel that good. And when they didn't, I was like, yeah, you're not the right one for me. Sorry. And I would break up with them, and I would go through this, just toxic cycle of, recycling these guys and going through, and I just end up empty every single time, and I'd be so confused. And it was it came from that. And I definitely saw, an escalation definitely as I got older, because I didn't find anything that would satisfy me. And so I just kept turning to that over and over and over again. So,
yeah. I think it'd be interesting to relate that when you say that you used it as a coping mechanism. Mm-hmm. It's important to acknowledge that with pornography, the reason why people turn to it is because there is usually there is a short-term reinforcement, mm-hmm. or a short-term, I guess we call it a reinforcement, even though it's a false sense of happiness, mm-hmm. and it is short-term. There is that short-term reinforcement which encourages people to go back to it again and again, and it can be related to substance abuse. I mm-hmm. recently had a conversation with a former performer, and this individual was in the porn industry for 7 years, and she was addicted to OxyContin, and she was addicted to cocaine. And she talked about how her escalating behavior with cocaine got to the point where she would snort cocaine, and there would be an immediate come down, there was no high.
Wow.
And she talked about how even despite that, she thought, she convinced herself that it was just a bad batch of cocaine. Mm. And then she would, do it again and again. And the concept is that people want it more but enjoy it less. And that same thing happens with pornography consumption.
I definitely agree with that, because there was seasons in my life where I would go from not saying, one type is, worse than another, but I would go from, just pornography, and then I would get creative with it. And then I go deeper and deeper into it because the regular stuff wouldn't satisfy me.
Yeah.
And so I would switch like all these different, keywords and all this stuff because I was like, oh, that's really interesting. But really it wasn't interesting. Like it didn't really change anything, because I would still, like you said, like it would just leave me still empty, just the same feeling. But I thought getting more would help, but it didn't. And I would convince myself like, oh, this is better than the regular stuff. And it really wasn't. It wasn't any different. It was actually kind of worse because it left me even more empty than I was whenever I started. So, yeah.
It's like the definition of desensitization.
Yeah.
Well, you've talked about how your porn consumption negatively affected your relationships, like with your significant others in the past. What about with friendships? Did you feel that any like platonic relationships were also negatively affected by your porn consumption?
Oh, definitely. There was always just that underlying disconnect between me and my friends because they never truly knew who I was. Because this version of Cassidy that I was pushing down as, a raging porn watcher and, all these secret addictions that I had at the time, I was pushing that version of myself down. And I was like, yeah, I'm this perfect person. I put myself out there on social media and everything. And they get to know that me. But when it really came down to it, they really didn't know who I was. Because they only knew the publicized version of me. They knew like the perfect version of me and not what I struggled with, at home.
Yeah.
And so that, always created such a big disconnect. And it wasn't until, I want to say like at the end of 2019, so after I graduated high school, I never wanted to talk about my story in high school because I was afraid of what people thought about me. And now looking back, like I really wish I would have. But at the time, I don't think I was strong enough and out of that, watching porn season of my life yet, enough to talk about it. And so once I graduated high school, I remember making a video. It was one of my first videos on TikTok about it. And I was joking. I made like a joke about it. And I was like, imagine being addicted to something for over a decade. And then it was like, yeah, that's actually true. And I had multiple people in my friend circle text me a screenshot of it. And they were like freaking out. They're like, what are you addicted to? Like, is it drugs? Like, are you drinking? What is it? Like, is it something we should be scared of?
Yeah.
And once I told them, it was like, not only was there like a deep weight lifted off my shoulders, but I felt like I didn't have to show up to these places and make sure that version of me wasn't showing anymore,
Wow.
And I felt, as free as I've ever felt in my entire life. And so to anybody that feels like, like you can't be vulnerable around people, like being vulnerable gives you the most power because it's sharing your story and nobody can contradict your story because that's what's happened to you. And after sharing my story with multiple people, I was like, in my friend circle, I was like, okay, I guess I can go and share it more on social media. And so as I did, hundreds of people started following me. And I was like, what? Are they doing this to make fun of me? Like, all my fears started racing through my head. I was like, they're doing this. They're sending it to their friends. They're laughing behind my back.
Yeah.
When in reality, I started reading these comments and they were like, girl, like, I struggled with it my entire life. I was introduced at the age of 3. I was, abused in my house and it translated into a deeper addiction for me and all these things. And I was like, I would get so emotional reading these comments because I was so afraid that I was, being, embarrassing myself. But in reality, I was like helping people come to terms with like freedom, you know?
Wow.
And, helping educate them. And there's definitely some friendships that I lost along the way. Like I said, along, taking my 2-year gap year. But there was some friendships that I lost along the years because they were like, there's no reason for you to be on social media talking about this part of your story. And I even got some hate from family members of mine because they were like, that's kind of embarrassing to put out. Like, I don't think you should be talking about that publicly. And that hurt, but also I was like, there's a generation gap there.
Yeah.
And so there's quite a few years between us, and there's definitely been some quarrels in my family about it, but at the end of the day, like, if I'm educating people, if I'm helping bring awareness to it and helping, girls, like you were saying at, the talk that you gave, like, people like that I want to reach and I want to impact and I want to educate and help them and, tell them that they're not alone. And so if I could do that and I lose people along the way, that's okay. Like, I'm fine with it. I've come to terms with it. It is what it is.
That's interesting because that is one of the challenges that we face when we're talking about the harmful effects of pornography today is that previous generations don't understand completely, and with good reason, because they just never experienced it. I'm not talking down to previous generations. I'm just stating facts that they didn't have to experience. They didn't experience the harmful effects of pornography to this level of intensity because of the ease of access and the privacy. Yeah. And so it's just something completely different. And I think I've said this before during this conversation, and I'll say it again. I'm sure that I admire you for moving forward and like speaking your story and helping change the conversation, despite some of those people like projecting their fear on you of like awkwardness.
Yeah. That's definitely, awkwardness is definitely something that you have to walk through when walking through talking about pornography, because nobody wants to talk about porn, sex in the open, unless you're one of those people that, has immense confidence in that, kudos to you. But for me, I've never found that to be a comfortable situation, especially coming from a house that is taboo, never talked about, very strict, religious family that, we can't, I could never talk about that, or, conversations like that never really came up. And so it was definitely like a homebred awkwardness. Like I already knew it was going to be awkward, but I'm a socially awkward person anyway. So it kind of just fit in. Like it kind of just made sense that I would talk about it. So
that's awesome.
Yeah.
Well, I think it's cool that you've talked about how part of your journey has been speaking out on it, and then it's been like your experience with porn consumption has hurt some relationships, but I imagine that it's also been helpful to a lot of your relationships. And what I mean by that is when you've started to speak out about the harmful effects of pornography and to your experience with it, I'm wondering if you can talk to like some of the benefits you've seen with other friends, because in my experience, and I want to ask if you agree or not, because I have been open about my journey and having healthy conversations in appropriate ways, it's like some of my friendships are even better today because of that vulnerability.
Yep, I totally agree. I definitely see that. So when I first started talking about it, there were friendships that I lost, but the friendships that I, kept and stayed with, they're so much stronger now than they were way back then. Because when you're vulnerable, that's not a selfish thing, but it's an inviting thing. Like it makes, when you're vulnerable in a community or in a group or one-on-one, it sets the tone for the other person. And so obviously when I'm having a conversation with somebody that's guards up, that they're fake laughing, that they're not really on the conversation, it makes it awkward. And I'm like, I can't really talk to you on a deep level as much as I want to. But somebody that comes in and they're like, dude, my week sucked. Like, these are all the bad things. Like,
sure.
They're just real.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. I'm like, okay, sweet. So like, yeah, my life sucks at the moment too. Like, I can get on that real conversation. I love real conversations like that where people aren't trying to, say that they're perfect or whatever, but they're like, dude, it sucks right now, but I have hope it'll be better. And this is, and so definitely those relationships were definitely strengthened. When it comes to relationships as in, not platonic, as in, romantic relationships, I'm currently with somebody that I met in high school. So when we met in high school, he was going through a season of smoking, and that was his addiction he was dealing with. And I was going through a season of pornography, and we didn't know that about each other. So those were like secrets we never knew. And I ended up graduating high school. We went on one date right after we graduated, and we went off to the same college together, and then I was told we were moving. And so I was like, crap, like now I gotta pack up my life. I just basically fell for this guy in one date and left him behind. And it was about 2.5 years. I flew back for a friend's wedding and was like, you know what, like just for kicks and giggles, do you want to come to the wedding with me? And he was like, yeah, for sure. Came to the wedding, we fell for each other right there, and we've been dating ever since.
Wow,
and
that's cool.
One of the conversations that we had way back when we were first talking, I mean, like way back in, what was that, 2019, we were still friends at the time, and I remember sitting with him, and I was like, okay, so like I really struggle with and I would keep coming up with words that weren't pornography, but I'd come up with like blanket statements that were like, yeah, like I really have some sexual problems. And he's like, you have sexual problems? And I was like, no, I don't want to tell you what I got. And so it was like, it took a few tries to get out of me, but finally I was like, I struggle with pornography, and I have, for a majority of my life, and that's just where I'm at. And he was like, cool, me too.
Oh, wow.
And I was like, I'm sorry, what? And he's like, yeah, like I've been struggling with it in my life too. And, I'm also doing this on the side. And there's just so much vulnerability that, was created in that moment. And it led, 2.5 years later, it led to where I trusted this man with everything because we had been so vulnerable before. And I see DMs, I see emails, comments, whatever, of girls asking me, and even guys asking me, like, how do I tell my significant other that I'm struggling with this, or that I watch this, or how will they react? And for me, it's just, you got to be vulnerable, because if I was never vulnerable in that state, I don't think we would have ever had that conversation, or never gotten to the point where we trusted each other enough to get in a relationship,
Yeah.
And the vulnerability sets, like I said earlier, the vulnerability sets the tone for the relationship, for the friendship. When I have speaking engagements, if I start the conversation off with, "Hi, I'm Cassidy, and I have struggled with pornography for this many years," the room changes, because it's not like they're judging me anymore. It's not like I'm scared to speak to them, but they're like, wow, like, I'm about to get something out of this. And wow, like, if I say my struggle, like, maybe they're thinking, like, my struggle isn't as bad as hers, so I can say it. And if that's what they're thinking, that's fine. Like, it still gets them to be vulnerable.
Yeah.
But it's like, it just creates that, like, I feel comfortable around them and around her. And that's always what I'm seeking in friendships and relationships, and, and especially, family relationships. Like, I never want that awkwardness or that, blanket of, like, yeah, I'm perfect. Like, I look like I have it all together on Instagram, which I did, when I was going through pornography, during those tough seasons of my life. And I had people say, like, oh my gosh, your life looks perfect. Like, you're wearing cute clothes. You post about A, B, and C, and you just look so perfect. And I was like, thanks. And then I'd, switch over on my phone and go watch something, and like, nobody knew that. And as soon as I started opening up and telling people, more and more people stepped forward, and they were like, okay, since you do it, like, since you said that, I can say, that I also struggle with it.
Yeah.
And the same thing about, educating people. It's like, once you educate somebody, it's a ripple effect. And so once you start that education with, like, hey, this is what pornography does to, your brain, to your health, to people around you, to, the world, whatever, this is what it does. They're not going to take that information and be like, wow, set it aside. They're going to take that information and either, like, chew on it and think about it for a while, and maybe it impacts them and, what their life looks like at the moment. Or they're going to turn around and be like, hey, did you hear about, this, and this? And they're going to keep spreading it, and it's going to go like wildfire. Yeah. I heard a saying one time, it was like, don't be a lake, be a river. And I was like, that's stupid. What does that mean? So I started thinking about it, and I was like, all of the things that we obtain, whether it's advice, whether it's life experience, whether it's, education about different harmful things in our life, whatever it might be, if we hold that for ourselves and be selfish with it, ultimately, we're just keeping it to ourselves. And so we're being a lake, if you will. But if we take that information and we spread it and we, talk about it on social media, it's scary posting on social media. I know once you do it, you're like, wow, like, I feel like I'm making a difference. And you are, because you never know who's watching your social medias and who's stalking your page or reading your stuff, Right. And when you get in that, like, I'm not a lake, but I'm a river mindset, you're like, okay, so what can I do with the information that was just given to me and project it in a way that people are going to be vulnerable with it, but they're going to take it not like I'm judging or not like I'm shaming, but that I'm helping them understand, like, this is what it does. And so it's definitely been a learning curve for sure, but at the end of the day, it's helped. The benefits of talking about it and being open and vulnerable about it has outweighed, the negatives so much.
Wow. I love that.
Yeah.
I think it's important to note too that because everyone's different, because we're all unique individuals with unique experiences and unique biology, some people shouldn't go online and talk about it. Yeah. Right? Mm-hmm. It just requires a lot of self-awareness.
I do think that's very wise, and I think it's something that you have to come up with. You have to weigh your risks and rewards on it, and you have to really come to terms, like, is this something that is beneficial for me in my life right now? Is it going to be well accepted? That's a question that, is bound to change, or an answer that's bound to change. But is it going to be well accepted? And do I have time in my life to deal with everything that comes with sharing my story or sharing the education? Because when you put that out there, it's not just going to be put out there and people are just going to praise you the rest of your life for putting that out there. And not everybody's going to agree with you. And like we talked about earlier, all those, like, hate comments and everything like that, like, you're going to have to deal with those at an increased volume from what you were before. And some people, like, they just can't handle that, whether it's, like, they get anxious around those type of situations, or whether that just overwhelms them, or whatever it is. Like, you have to be a specific kind of person to be able to be like, I'll post it and block it all off. Like, it's fine.
Yeah.
And if you're not there yet and you want to become that, like, that's where discipline and everything else, like we talked about earlier, comes into play. But it's definitely, like, you have to be self-aware of what season of life that you're in, if that's something that you can handle at the moment or not.
Yeah, that makes sense, because a trigger, like when we're talking about what is going to trigger a person to return to their pornography consumption, some of the triggers can be like stress or anxiety or sadness. And I think that if you do go online and talk about it, and if you're not in a position, like you said, like this season of life where you're ready for that, it can cause those triggers to occur and then, take you back to porn consumption. So anyway, I think it's important to note that context matters and self-awareness is important. One thing that I am curious to know is if during these 9 to 10 years of porn consumption, if there's like a moment that stands out to you as like your low of lows, meaning like a moment where you felt completely hopeless, where you were trying to, rewire your brain back to a healthier state, but you just lost all hope that you would ever have the ability to improve your decision making.
Oh, definitely. I was, I guess, 18 at the time. It was right before I figured out, like, I have a problem. And I guess I was 19. So 19, so I graduated, and it was in my move from Texas back to Florida. And I remember moving in, and I didn't have any friends. I was totally alone. And that's one of the main things I hear nowadays is like, well, I'm alone. I'm not in a relationship. My parents don't really care what I do. So that's how I got on this track. And basically, I had been, I don't know if sober is the right word, but I've been clean, I guess you'd say, from probably, I don't know, I took a break. So sometimes it would get so boring to me that I'd be like, yeah, it like doesn't really do anything for me anymore.
Okay.
And then part of me would be like worried. I'd be like, oh my gosh, like, did I like make myself not be able to like,
almost like this permanent damage that you've caused.
Did I like damage myself, and so then I get scared and freaked out and I wouldn't do it for a while. And so I'd probably been clean for, I don't know, 2 or 3 months, and within those months I had moved. And so we got to our new place, and it's developed, I'm very open about this, but it's developed deep. Like I said, it's misdiagnosed as anxiety, but OCD for me, reconstructures my brain into freaking out. So basically I struggle with both. And during that time, I went through a huge mental health breakdown. I didn't leave the new house that we had moved into for like 1.5 to 2 months. I felt like I developed deep agoraphobia, which is like a fear of leaving the house and going in public social settings. And during those times, I was like, well, I'm not leaving the house. I'm anxious. I can't really eat. I'm going through all these mental health problems. The only thing that makes me feel good is watching pornography. And so it would be a daily thing. It'd be like, I'm not talking to anybody. I'm really like in this really deep depression I was walking through. I wasn't leaving the house. I wasn't in college. Didn't have any friends here. All I had was like family. And I was like trying to distance myself from them because I couldn't go around them because I had, all these anxious thoughts and all these things. And so I just turned to pornography to somewhat be a release, to be a coping mechanism, to be a friend, because I thought, it would make me feel better. And for those, let's round up and say 2 months, the one thing that I relied on the most was pornography. And so I'd get up in the morning, I'd, do a glorified version of my morning routine. I'd go out throughout my day and I'd be like, I'm good. Like I go on a walk, I'd, get in the fresh air. I'm like, I can do this. Like, it's no problem. I go upstairs, sit down, have nothing to do, nobody to talk to. And I'm like, okay, sweet, it's about that time. And I do that, like, it would happen weekly, daily. And it was to the point where I was watching it probably like 4 to 5 times a week. Yeah. And that's when I was like, there's a problem here. Like, there's a deep problem. And so coming out of that, overly obsessed with it season for that 2 months, I ended up telling my mom, I was like, I need to seek help. I need, a therapist or a counselor or something. And she was like, at the time, she was like, okay, I mean, yeah, we can go see, a religious person about this. And, I'm sure it's, that. And when in reality it wasn't. I just needed help. And so we went to somebody who was a licensed therapist. And I went through about 2 sessions with her. By the end of the second session, she was like, just a random question, are you addicted to pornography? And I was like, what? Like, did I say that? Like, did I slip up and say that? And because I wasn't telling anybody at the time, and I was like, did I say something that hinted at that? And she was like, Well, you kind of alluded to that because of, all these different symptoms that you're experiencing, and that's symptoms of somebody who's overly addicted to something and using something as a coping mechanism. And I just looked at her and I was like, wow, like that just summed up the past however many years I've been addicted to this. And
Wow.
I went into talking about it with her. And I've never, ever talked to somebody about that on such a deep level. I was like, I think it stems from my parents and the way that I was parented. And I think it stems from my childhood. And I was just going through all these different ideas. And she was like, doesn't it feel so good to get that off your chest? And I was like, yes, because I've been carrying it for so long, And she was like, she was giving me like hope. And she was like, there is a way out of this. There is a way to stop watching it. And she's like, but it's not going to be fun for you. And I was like, what do you mean it's not going to be fun? Like, it's going to be easy. And so she was like, okay, well, when you get, tempted to watch that, you're going to have to put your phone in the other room for like 2 hours. And I was like, okay, it's literally so easy. Got home and I was like, all right, it's about that time. And I was like, oh, wait, I'm not doing that anymore. So I went and put my phone in the other room and went back in the other room. And I was like, so what am I supposed to do? Like, 2 hours? And I'm like looking up at the ceiling. I'm like, well, I'll get on my laptop instead. And sure enough, getting on my laptop just so happened to lead to the exact thing I was trying to avoid.
Yeah.
And it was like, in that moment, I was like, I have a problem. Like, if I have to put down a device and pick up another one just to fulfill that craving, that's not good. And I need to seek deeper help. And so I started going to therapy more often. And I started talking to her about, I'm putting down one device and picking up another. And she was like, well, you need to put every kind of electronic device you can get your hands on, put them somewhere else. And, go out with your family, go out with friends. Like, the distractions of walking with family, taking walks around the neighborhood or whatever, like, I don't know if anybody, listening to this has tried that, but it works. Because as soon as I walk out that door and see family, I'm not thinking about that anymore. Like, I'm not going to put my family and that in the same box. You know what I'm saying? And so it's like this huge, like, distraction for me. And it's helped so much. And therapy is so good. It's so healthy. And even if you don't struggle with pornography, like, I would recommend therapy to every single person. Like, there are some deep-rooted things that people go through that they don't realize affects them until later on in life when they're like, oh, yeah, that's probably the cause of that. And they're like, well, that's not resolved in my life. And I still have a lot of hate for that person or a lot of, unresolved feelings about that. And it brought so many things up to the surface, about my childhood, about, how I was parented or how I was, raised and everything like that. And it was very, very helpful. And so I definitely recommend that.
That's so cool. I've been thinking a lot about what causes a person to turn to pornography. In this case, we're talking about pornography. So I've been thinking a lot about that. What makes a person, like, what are the whys, the different whys as to why people turn to pornography? And I don't want to oversimplify this, but I want to get your opinion on it because I've been thinking about it a lot lately. And again, I don't want to oversimplify it, but I think it comes down to like 4 possible whys. And again, tell me what you think. So the first one is you're either doing too much, like excessive stress. Or too little, like you're bored. Like you're not you're not engaging in activities that are healthy for you, that are like challenging you and that you really enjoy and are interested in. And then the other 2 are your biology can sometimes be the reason why. And the reason why that could be the case is like, look at your example, for example, because you have a tendency to experience like anxiety and the OCD, that is part of your biology. Those were triggers and you didn't know how to deal with those. And then the last one is trauma that's like not dealt with. So it's those 4, too much, like too little, or trauma and biology.
I think all of those are right. And I think one to add on is desperate. When I was at my lowest is when I was most desperate. And I was desperate for people to love me. I was desperate to be wanted. I was desperate for attention from family, from friends, from guys, from the internet, from whatever.
Yeah.
And I think that's because, there's a season, so I would say I was in, I don't even know, sophomore year when I first started dating around. And there was a gap between a relationship I vividly remember. And Snapchat is awful. Let me just say that. I hate that app with everything within me. And I remember downloading that app, and I figured out you could add people that you didn't know. Like, you didn't have to know them in real life to add them on, Snapchat. And I was like, that's really interesting. It was not interesting. It was the most harmful thing I could have done. So I started adding all these random people, and they started asking me for, pictures and for different things. And I was like, I'm going to be I'm going to be the object that people are interested in. And it was in that moment, like in one of those, picture sending whatever, that I was like, oh my gosh, like it not only changed, like the narrative changed from me being desperate for like watching this and getting the satisfaction from this, if you will, to people are desperate for me. And I was like, oh my gosh, like that went up a level,
Did you like put stock in that and value that other people wanted that from you?
Oh, for sure.
Okay.
Yeah. I was definitely like, it would boost my confidence.
Yeah, that's what I was trying to say.
Yeah. I was like, oh yeah, well, people like me online, so they have to like me in person.
Okay.
And then the sad reality of that would hit later. But it was definitely like, it would boost my confidence. It would make me feel better about myself. I go in and do these things, and then I leave my phone somewhere, and I'd be 10 times more, like I'd have more, happiness or whatever. And I'd be like, oh my gosh, yeah, like I could do whatever. And then it was like, that's crazy. So many people know what I look like, but nobody knows me for me. And that's when I was like, okay, like there's something here that's amiss. That's, something's wrong. And that's when I, figured out that I was desperate for something. And I was putting all of my eggs in this one basket of like, well, I have to prove myself, and I have to, put myself up for, making somebody happy, or making my body be enough for somebody. And like my whole thing is always, if you lead with your body, you have to keep it with your body. And so I've entered into plenty of relationships where I've been like, okay, well, like we'll just jump from this to this, and you'll get to see all of me. And then whenever it gets to a point where the guy or whoever would get bored, they would be like, well, like what else is there to offer? And I'm like, well, is this not enough? And then it would develop this, like, I'm not enough. Like, I'm really not enough. And then since I would get desperate in that I need that attention, I would just convert that into a different relationship. I would just be like, yeah, you're not, it's fine. Let's just break up, move on. I'll go get attention from somebody else, somewhere else. And so I agree with everything that you were saying. And the biology part is really interesting because I want to say the word is hereditary. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it's hereditary in your genes or DNA, whatever it might be. The correct word for it. But my family has had a lot of addictions run in our family. And so I didn't know that. But now, talking to my parents and being open about it, my certain side of the family struggled a lot with alcoholism. And the other part struggled a lot with being workaholics. And whether or not people want to admit it, work is a very big addiction for some people. Like they crave that and they need that to survive. And obviously you need it for money purposes, but some people crave that. And so that's just in my DNA that I was like, I was born to have that natural, addictive personality, tendency, whatever. It just so happened that the luck of the draw was pornography for me. And so I think it's very wise if you see that and if you know that. So for me, eventually becoming, getting married and having kids, I want to be open with them and being like, this is something that runs rampant in our family and in our, line of descent. And I want you to know this so that you can practically put that into effect for your life and know I'm not going to turn to alcohol because I have, alcoholic tendencies in my family. Or I'm not going to watch pornography because, my mom struggled with it a lot and keep on going up the line with that. And so I think that's really, really important. And I don't think that's talked about enough, how it's hereditary and how it can easily run in your DNA from, older family members than you. And it could easily be, transmitted to you. So I think that's really wise. And I think that goes straight to trauma, how you were talking about that, like, unresolved trauma or untalked about trauma, like all of that can easily be a pathway or a road into pornography or into other coping mechanisms because you're like, well, I have nobody to talk to about this, I'm alone in this, nobody knows what I'm feeling, and to escape from reality, I'm going to go watch this. Like, I think that I've done that, many times in my life with, whether it's family traumas or grief, going through seasons of losing family members in my life. It's definitely been hard, and that pornography was a huge coping mechanism in all of those. So I can definitely see how trauma is a big reason why.
Right. Well, I think it's common for people to turn to porn or consume porn in an impulsive state. I think a very significant amount of consumers are doing it in an impulsive state with no forethought of, future possible consequences. But as a person as it escalates, a person becomes more aware of the harmful effects. And my question is regarding a person who has the desire to work towards zero consumption. Mm-hmm. As a person works towards zero consumption, it can be very common to experience what feels like failure and also like a setback. Mm. As you journeyed, like as you met with your therapist and started to, put your devices in the other room for a couple hours, did you have any setbacks? Can you talk to those? And what advice do you have for people who are, in that process of journeying towards zero consumption, but are having some of those, failures or setbacks?
Setbacks were definitely something that I struggle with, from coming off of watching it, weekly for over 10 years to all of a sudden wanting to sober and clean up. Like, obviously it wasn't an overnight, which I believed it was. I was like, oh, I'm going to wake up the next day and I'm not going to watch it. Like, I'm going to be fine and I'm going to, clean up my life from this. And then the next morning I wake up and I'm like, I'm going to watch it now. Like, There's definitely, you have to be aware and you have to know, and hopefully this encourages people who are watching this. It's not an overnight fix. And so if you wake up the next morning and you stumble and, watch it or whatever your, consumption of it looks like, if that happens for you when you're in that journey of trying to, get clean or sober up or whatever you want to call it, I want to encourage you that it's not an overnight fix. And there's people that'll say, well, we'll just stop watching it. Okay, well, you stop smoking or you stop doing things that you're, overly obsessed with that you've been doing for so long that's a habit almost. Yeah. And so I never want somebody to feel like, well, I've fallen, too many times off the wagon. I just can't get back up. You can. And the self-discipline is going to be hard. It's not going to be fun. It's going to be ugly and it's going to look weird. So personally, in relationships, I think we talked about this earlier, I tend to take relationships too far when it comes to, okay, well, I've watched this for so many years, then I'm accustomed to having that in my brain. So when I enter into relationships, I expect that to naturally come out of those relationships. Mm-hmm. And so for me, I've had to put up very strict boundaries in relationships. And they've looked weird. Talking to people, I'm very odd about this. And I'll tell you because, we're talking about it. But definitely in a college standpoint where I am now, there's things where I'm like, oh yeah, well, I don't really want to go to that event or that party or whatever because there's going to be blank involved. And I know if I get down that, then I'll get down this and that'll lead to pornography. And it's making those, being self-aware enough and having enough strength to be I know if I do A, B, and C, that's going to lead to porn. And so I know I don't want to get back down that road, and having strength to be just say no. And just to be okay, you're going to look at me weird and you might hate me after this for a little bit, but I promise you'll get over it, but it's a no for me. And having the strength to say no is a really big thing. The other one that I'd say, basically looking back when I, kept falling short and stuff, is getting more and more educated helped me, I don't want to say, I keep saying disgusted. I don't want to say disgusted, but it made me look at porn with a different view. And so whenever I started, I think I got into Fight the New Drug, I don't know, probably 6 or 7, 8 months ago. I'm not sure. During those, 6 to 8 months, sharing your story, like we were talking about earlier, it allows you to walk back down that road of where you were. And so it can sometimes be tempting for you to fall back down that road also if you're not, farther along in your walk, journey, whatever. Yeah. And that's also something you have to be very aware of. If you're not fully out of that yet, you probably shouldn't be sharing it yet because you're going to have to share parts that you don't like or parts that might make you stumble again. So you have to be very aware of okay, where am I actually at? And be honest with yourself. Am I actually ready to share this or not? But watching and seeing myself go through all of those times where I fell short and stuff, I had to come to terms with okay, what is it actually doing for me? What is this benefiting me? Is it making me actually feel better? Is it making me perform better? Is it whatever? And I would look up these articles on Fight the New Drug on Google Scholar, and I started reading them, and I was like, okay, great. So it leads to less gray matter in the brain. That's great. It leads to shrinking in the brain. That's great. And I'm reading through all these things, and I'm in my stomach, I'm I'm never going to watch that again. I don't feel like I ever want to watch it. Because, it made this repulsiveness in me. And having that repulsiveness in me made it easier for me to stop. Because I was not only is it harming me, but it's harming other people around me in the industries, in, the trafficking realm, and, all these other things. And I was like, yeah, I don't want to watch that, because I know now what it really is. And exposing it, like, you guys do such a great job of exposing pornography for what it truly is. Like, it's all fake. Like, it's all actors, and like all these things are so fake, and we're altering our mindset around like, oh, that's perfect. That's what love is. That's not love. These people don't even know each other. Like, that shouldn't be what our, expectation of love is, because that's not really what love is to begin with, But I definitely think education has a huge part in, helping you overcome that battle.
Yeah. And even in scenarios where the performers know each other, it's very problematic in a plethora of ways. Mm-hmm. And I think kind of what you're speaking to, like the technical term is like supernormal stimulus. Like porn experts are referring to it as a supernormal stimulus, meaning that it's exaggerated and it spikes the reward pathway at a certain level, and then there is that desensitization that happens. And I mean, we can go on and on. It's problematic in many ways, but yeah. I appreciate you talking to all of those things. As you talked about these boundaries that you've set, you mentioned the computer and all these electronic devices in the other room for 2 hours, and then you also mentioned all these different things. Did you set these boundaries yourself, or did you have help with your therapist or another individual?
Definitely I had help with a therapist on the electronic part, because that was at the beginning of my journey when I didn't know what boundaries, I didn't know what those things were called, or I didn't know they were useful. Yeah. And so my therapist definitely helped me in those. And then in the dating aspect, I remember when we first started dating, we were both like, okay, we have struggled with this in the past, and we both know and are very much aware that we do not want to go back down that road with each other at the moment, or we don't want to do that individually. That helped so much. And so having that one-on-one, like, I want to call it accountability partner, but having that person that knows. Yeah. Like, not even, I remember when I first, like, told somebody, I told them, like, the very clean version of it. I was like, yeah, I watch it, like, once a month. Like, it's not that big of a deal. But at the time, I was watching it, 4 to 5 times a week. Yeah. And when somebody knows, like, ultimately what you're going through without a filter on it, that's when you're going to get the most help. And for me, it was not only opening up to my therapist, but opening up to my boyfriend and being like, this is what I struggle with. I know you struggle with it too. And let's both be vulnerable so we can help each other. And then it translated into, okay, I'm going to tell my mom about it, because I'm already talking about it on social media. So she's going to figure it out eventually, or somebody's going to tell her, like, your daughter's talking about pornography online, might as well come from me. So it's talking to my mom about that. And now that somebody else knows about it, they can hold me accountable. And they're like, do you really think that's a good decision to be watching that if, it'll lead you to that? And there are movies and shows that I've had to stop watching, over the course of, 1 or 2 years when I've tried to been, sobering up and getting clean again. There's shows that, whether I like it or not, they ultimately lead me down a road I don't want to be on.
Right. It all comes down to self-awareness, because what triggers you might not trigger another person, and vice versa. What triggers another person might not trigger you. So it really does come down to self-awareness. And I think kind of what you're talking to, I think the technical term is like sensitization, that as someone consumes pornography and reinforces that behavior again and again and again, there's these sensitized porn pathways that are like cues, like random cues that might not trigger someone else, but they can trigger you because of what's happened to you, because of your experiences and what you've been exposed to. So I talked to a friend recently. He reached out to me and said, have you ever heard that quote that we climb just to fall? And I was like, I really haven't heard that. And he was like, well, is that true? Do you think that we climb just to fall? And it kind of falls in line with what we're talking about when we're talking about, journeying towards zero consumption and having setbacks. And he was referring to that, his journey towards zero consumption, and then, having a setback and then feeling like he lost all of his progress because of that setback. And we were kind of comparing it. We were expounding on this quote, do we climb just to fall? And we started relating it to Free Solo. Have you watched that video?
I haven't.
So there's a guy who climbed El Capitan in California, and if you fall, like it's a cliff, you'll die, And so he risked his life to climb this Free Solo, meaning that he wasn't tied into the mountain, Like
Oh.
he summited this without any ties.
Wow.
And it's a really intense movie. And he was kind of thinking of his journey towards zero consumption like that, where if he fell, that meant like all of his progress was erased. And we started talking about like, no, it's actually not like that. It's more like you have these steps, like you're climbing this big staircase. And if you trip and fall in the staircase and hit your shin, that doesn't mean that you lost the progress that you've made. It just means that you acknowledge that you hit your shin, and you're like, man, that wasn't fun. You can sit down for a second and reflect on it, but that doesn't mean you have to throw yourself down this staircase, right? And you can sit, reflect, rest, and then regroup and press forward on your journey. So I just wanted to emphasize that for our listeners. It's like, progress and take it slow, and it's very probable you will have setbacks. That's part of it. It doesn't mean that you've lost the progression that you've made.
I definitely agree with that. And I think that everybody's speed of progression and healing is different. And so I recently went gluten-free, and I'm saying this with like a grain of salt because I really can't stick with diets like that. But I was like, I'm gonna go gluten-free, like I'm gonna be bougie, I got it all figured out, like I got my Pinterest plans and everything, and I kept falling short. So I'd be like, okay, for breakfast, I'm gonna have this, and it's not gonna have any gluten, and it'd be great. Then I get to school, and I'm like, I really want a Philly cheesesteak, so I go out and get a Philly cheesesteak, and I would fall short like that. But my motive was still clear on where I wanted to go, but the progression was slower.
Yeah.
And so now I've gotten to a point where, okay, now I've gotten all of my boundaries laid out. So I'm like, okay, when I get to lunch, I'm eating a salad. I'm not eating anything on the salad except fruit that don't have gluten in it. And so I like line everything out, but I had to take baby steps to get there.
Yeah.
So it was like, okay, I'm not just going to go cold turkey. And I mean, really, you can't. I mean, going cold turkey, I'm going to say this in my own opinion, is really kind of bad in any situation if you don't wean yourself off of it, because coming from somebody who's been on anxiety medication or was on anxiety medication for a big portion of her life and cutting all of that off and then like going through serotonin syndrome for a week and almost dying, like you have to wean yourself off like little by little.
Yeah.
And so just reiterating, like, your healing journey won't look the same, and your speed, like, climbing up the mountain might be faster for some people, but people that have tendencies, like we were just talking about in, your biology or your makeup, like, that's going to look different in each person. So it might take you a little bit longer to get there. So if you do fall and you do, scrape your shin or whatever, you can sit there for a little bit and contemplate, how could I have done this better? And then go an alternative, yeah, there you go.
Yeah.
Alternative route, figuring out which way works best for you and just pursuing that and getting clean from it.
Yeah, 100%. Well, Cass, as we come to the conclusion of this conversation, we want to leave you with the opportunity to have the last word. And so if there's anything on your heart or mind that we haven't discussed yet, we'd love to hear those thoughts as well.
I think ultimately I just want to leave you with 2 words, like, you can. And like we were just talking about, if you fall and if you, feel like you can't get back up again, you can. Because if you're once standing, you can stand again. And ultimately, like, going off of that, like, the resources that Fight the New Drug offers is so important. And the resources that, research studies hold on the internet, finding reputable ones, and you guys are good about, like, navigating those and pointing us to those. But finding those research studies and educating yourself. Educating is so important to your healing journey, to other people's. Like, the more people that we educate, the more of a ripple effect it is, and the more we'll make a change in this industry and in, the healing journeys for multiple people. And so I just want to leave you with, you have the opportunity, you have a chance to make a change, to make an impact, and it's all up to you. The opportunity is yours.
I love it. You've been great. You are great. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Talking about porn can be tricky. That's why we created an interactive conversation guide called Let's Talk About Porn. Simply select who you'd like to talk to, your partner, child, friends, parents, or even a stranger, and select the type of conversation you'd like to have. We'll walk you through a healthy way to approach this taboo topic in a productive conversation. Let's Talk About Porn is available for free, both in English and Spanish, so you can be prepared to talk when someone asks why you're listening to a podcast about the harms of porn. access the guide and start talking at ftnd.org/blueprint. That's ftnd.org/blueprint.
Thanks for joining us on this episode of Consider Before Consuming. Consider Before Consuming is brought to you by Fight the New Drug. Fight the New Drug is a non-religious and non-legislative organization that exists to provide individuals the opportunity to make an informed decision regarding pornography by raising awareness on its harmful effects using only science, facts, and personal accounts. If you want to learn more about today's guest and the conversation we had, you can check out the links included with this episode. Again, big thanks to you for listening to this conversation. As you go about your day, we invite you to increase your self-awareness, look both ways, check your blind spots, and consider before consuming.